What I'll be talking about is using domain modeling to validate a hypothesis. Before I jump into the detail, a really quick introduction about myself. My name is Sonal. I am a business analyst. Well, I'm a business analyst by trade, but I think what I really enjoy doing is solving problems. And even though it sounds a little corny, but the reason I really love engaging with and solving problems is because I think on the other side of a problem, there's always an amazing story to be told, like the one I'm going to share with you today. Now, for those of you in the audience who are familiar with domain-driven design, you would have heard about domain-driven design in the context of software design and software architecture. And that's been the story for, I think it's been 20 years now since Eric Evans first published the Blue Book. And what I'm now going to aim to answer is, can we extend these techniques and use them to perhaps solve other problems, like a prioritization problem? So this talk's going to be about domain modeling for problem solving, our experiments with analysis to get to that point, and a bit of a self-indulgent talk on navigating ambiguity. And if you're kind of asking, hang on, what are you talking about again? So what I'm talking about is using domain modeling to solve a prioritization problem that helped us shape the program of work. So not architecture, not design, but really helping teams shape the work that we're doing. I'll set the stage by telling you a little bit about the client and the situation, and then go on to the ask. So it was a pretty standard financial services organization. What was very interesting about the engagement was that we were focused on implementing observability. It was an engineering problem that we were solving because our client had a lot of complex compliance obligations. Because it was financial services, they were processing a lot of sensitive data. And because they had compliance obligations across geographies, teams were siloed, governance teams were also siloed, not just engineering teams. And there were a lot of controls that they had to work with, including a lot of manual controls. And all they wanted was, can we automate this and make life simple for us? But this would end up being a really large program of work. And therefore, the problem was, hey, can you help us prioritize what's really critical to this program of work so that we can make sure we're really delivering value? And can you help us then shape this program of work? Before I go on to our experiments with analysis, I do want to talk about, well, why domain modeling in this scenario? And I feel that security is a domain that really lends itself well to domain modeling. Security as a domain really focuses on the business risk and the decisions that need to be made around that business risk. And if I were to really oversimplify security, what it's talking about is the person who should not be doing a thing is not doing a thing. But the thing is so specific to the business and so specific to what information systems or data is confidential to that organization, what impacts availability for their customers, what impacts the integrity of their information. So to understand the business context was really important. And therefore, actually, before I go into the therefore, because I forgot about this slide, I do also want to highlight that observability is expensive. Because observability is not just about seeing what's happening in the environment. It's also about then relating that to what could be happening in the environment. And in an increasingly complex technology landscape, that becomes a very expensive problem to solve. If I haven't lost any of you yet, I will continue on to our experiments with analysis. And I do apologize about me sort of missing slides because this is the first time I'm running this. So sometimes I am thinking about a different slide and this shows a different slide. So we didn't start with domain modeling. We started with trying to model the systems the way any good engineering team does. So, well, we started with a component diagram. And we thought that would help us identify the engineering value. And then we could translate that engineering value into a dollar value and run a cost benefit analysis. And we thought that that was a really great thing to do, because you know what the system is, you know what the actor is, what the benefit is. You can translate that benefit into a dollar figure, and that's obviously the best way to solve this problem. But it isn't, because it's not telling us about the risks that are critical to the organization. It's not telling us whether the activity that we're trying to automate is actually critical to the business or just important for that actor. It's giving a system view and not a business view. So any efficiencies we identify are meaningless. Well, not meaningless, but they aren't really contributing to that value that they're looking for if the process is not valuable to the business. So what else we could do? We could develop a decision-making framework, and then we could represent all of the controls on this framework and let the framework decide for us. That also means we don't have to be accountable for decisions, so it's a double win. And this framework's amazing, right? Because it talks of control desirability, criticality of the risk, technical feasibility, cost of ownership, and it maps it beautifully. You know exactly which control to prioritize. So what could go wrong with this? Well, what could go wrong with this, and what does go wrong with something like that as the first approach, is that you don't know who's telling you the story. So yes, we've got a score for criticality and desirability, but who's telling you that story? From whose perspective? And then anything that comes after that, again, is contingent on the fact that our starting point perhaps was not right. And there are many other ways in which we can tell our story, right? We can talk about what the capabilities are. We can try and qualify all of the value. But any story we tell is only telling the second part of the story. And I do want to emphasize here that it's not that the second part of the story is not valuable. It's just that the first part is, excuse me. Yeah, so it's not that the second part of the story is not valuable. It's just that it's dependent on us getting the first part of the story right. And that is where I'm going to take a pause and drink some more water. Amazing, thank you. So what we had with all of those experiments, and what that sort of reiterated, was that we had insight and visibility on the engineering value, but we needed to understand the business and what's driving the business. We knew why we were implementing observability. We knew that observability would enable controls automation. We knew why controls automation was important, because controls automation would enable the organization to be proactive with their risk management. That made perfect sense. We knew a lot. But like we were talking about, we really didn't know operational constraints, impacts. We didn't know the risks that were critical to the business for their decision making. And a recent conversation I was having with a colleague also was something along these lines, where we were talking of the value of a computational system is really when it's able to move data and decisions around that data. So if we don't understand the underlying decision-making criteria and reasons, then we're not really moving decisions around data, and therefore we're not really enabling business value. What did we do? We collaborated, and we used domain storytelling to model a use case. This is a very simple scenario. It is a scenario of someone raising a change request and a change being implemented. It has a change approval process. It has a change implementation process. And then, because this is financial services, regulated and audited, there is an audit process on the other side of it. So if you are not familiar with domain storytelling, just very quickly, domain storytelling has three components: the actor, the activity, and the work object on which the activity is happening. And so it's able to tell the story like you and I would talk, taking away from complex jargon. Now, when we were looking at this use case, one of our colleagues suddenly had this epiphany and they went, the problem is that security fails at the seams. And if you're wondering what seams we are talking about, you're not alone. I was quite confused as well. But the seam that we were talking about is in this diagram, the seam between different business processes. You might wonder, why is this the seam and maybe why not this? And that would be a really good point for us to jump into a conversation about heuristics. But before we get to the heuristics, I do want to talk about the fact that at this point, we made a very conscious decision to experiment with bounded context. Now, bounded context, as you might have heard, is a best bet on things that change together. Bounded contexts are emergent and evolutionary, and they're very specific to the domain. The fact that they're specific to the domain is really important because it directly links to the conversation around enabling business decision making. So we had to prioritize controls for automation. We had a hypothesis, security fails at the seams, and we had a view of the seams. If you're wondering, so where do heuristics fit in? What we wanted to do was we wanted to look at competing heuristics and see if we're able to identify seams where we can find those high-risk events. If we used 3 different heuristics, would we get 3 different seams? Would we get conflicting high-risk events, or would the seams align? If we test the failure points at each of the seams, what happens next? So that's the journey we embarked on. So if you look at this use case again, it's changed to a system with the heuristic of business processes. And yes, I recognize I've abruptly jumped to event storming. You've got all of the domain events modeled in yellow, any hotspots or concerning things highlighted in red, and the whites are just information. So if you look at a business process, the seam that we encountered was, as in the previous diagram, the approval process and the implementation process. Another heuristic we looked at was the heuristic of time. When was it approved versus when was it implemented? Incidentally, the seam aligned with the previous one. And then we said, perhaps another good heuristic, because we're talking about security, is integrity of information. So you do not want a scenario where integrity of information would be impacted. So perhaps let's use that as a heuristic to identify seams. And for this use case, we had the same seam again. Where that left us at this point was, we actually started wondering, are we using the wrong heuristics? Or are we just using 3 different names for the exact same heuristic? Is it the exact same failure and we're just calling it by 3 different names? So we said, let's perhaps make it a little more granular and expand on the approval process and then see what happens. Now, in the approval process, when we looked at the business process heuristic, we weren't really convinced that that red seam there is actually a business process seam. It was more like a breakup of activities in the same process, but perhaps you might want to argue it as the process of raising an approval, a request for approval, and the process of validating it, and then the process of approving it. So we parked it. And then if you look at time, again, time as a heuristic just didn't make sense in the scenario. It really seemed like a force heuristic. And we started wondering, is handoffs a better heuristic? Because if you think of when approvals happen without software systems, which might not be the best analogy because we are talking of software systems, but if you had to sort of push paper to get approvals, there would be a lot of handoffs, and perhaps it is the handoffs that really impacts security and not the time of approval versus the time of implementation. And that also lends well to handoffs impact the integrity of information. But then in this situation, if the information changes, that's actually a good thing, because something's missing and therefore it's being sent back, so you want the information to change. So the seam is actually not a failure point. And what we started finding is that these conversations around competing heuristics actually drive and refine the conversation. They seem a little clunky and they start making you question whether you're on the right track, but it does help refine conversations. And another very interesting thing, which I have not highlighted, was that the approval system actually enforced that mandatory information check. And we started wondering, is that a security control or is that something else? Because if that's not a security control, should we be automating it? And then we thought, let's look at heuristics and take something that's completely different from change. Maybe we'd find something over there. And what if you looked at patching? So we jumped right into infrastructure resilience. Now, this is a lazy slide, I acknowledge. I have not spent a lot of time putting the sticky notes, but all of these 5 notes are around, a patch availability process and a patch information update process and scheduling the patch update and automating the patch update and validating that the patch is fine. And as we sort of went through the different heuristics that we've spoken about, you could argue that patching is one process, or you could argue that these are 5 different processes. Given that we've got patch being scheduled for an update and an automated patch update, is time really a factor? And we'd already started doubting time as a heuristic in the previous example as well. And we kind of said, we're perhaps looking at handoffs and not time. But then this is automated, so there are no handoffs that exist. And when you're looking at integrity of information, this scenario just didn't answer the integrity of what information exactly. So lots of thoughts at this point. Where is the seam? Is it at every process or is there no seam? And if there is no seam and our working hypothesis is that security fails at the seams, perhaps our hypothesis is wrong. But as you start discussing this, the conversation actually got pretty interesting because it then went to the point where you're thinking, hang on, the domain of security is not really limited to events happening within your organization. The domain of security and the seams in your business are actually impacted by events happening external to your business. So when you are sort of taking decisions around the risks and how you'd want to prioritize things that are critical to your business, the modeling needs to expand to beyond internal processes and internal activities. Where does that get us? Does security fail at the seams? Well, to be honest, we did not make any breakthrough in solving the complexities in the field of security. But what we did begin to see across multiple other use cases is a pattern emerge. The impact of a failure at a boundary was a lot higher than the impact of a failure within the context. As you are collaborating and modeling scenarios together, some of the things that start coming up are ubiquitous language problems. In fact, in our very first scenario of change meant different things to different people. To the person raising a change request, change meant the change request. But to the people implementing the change meant the actual change implementation. If nothing else, that was a great outcome. But what we also had was a lot of really good conversations around things that are important and key to decision making, bringing more nuance and perspective into the heuristics that we were using. This is the point where I go into my self-indulgent thoughts on navigating ambiguity and problem solving. That's the ask that started it all. And if you look at the words over there, we're talking about how do you prioritize controls? How do you shape a program of work? Why have these become like such big, daunting things? They're all mechanisms that help you get clarity. We all work in ambiguous environments. But the very interesting thing is that I feel humans navigate ambiguity all the time. When you wake up in the morning and your plan is to get to work, that's actually a lot of ambiguity there because your pet might fall sick. You don't even know that your pet might fall sick. So there's multiple layers of ambiguity at that point. But that's never stopped us from saying, oh my God, this is so ambiguous. I don't know if I'd even know whether I could get to work. And the reason is because you've got a framework that you're using to sort of work through that ambiguity. So there's the intent to get ready and take the train to work. There's the reality that your pet's unwell. And you never thought that was ambiguous. And then there is a structure that we're all working with. So you'd perhaps call in late. If you're someone like me, you'd ask your partner to take the day off because really your job's more important than his. And you would finally manage to find yourself at work. Perhaps there'd be a bit of an adjustment in the plan. I'd take an Uber rather than the train to work, but the cat's really not stopping me from getting to work. All of that ambiguity, I'm not even thinking through it as I get to clarity. So while I might really love my cat, it does not matter in the story. I recognize that software systems and complexity in the landscapes that we're working with is a lot more than a pet falling sick. I'm not trying to draw an equivalence, but essentially what we're all doing at every point is we've got frameworks, we've got maps, we've got tools that we're constantly working with. And a great thing to do is to always keep adapting and playing with that. And I really love playing with my tools. So bounded context, for instance, your first go-to move wouldn't be, oh, let's use 3 heuristics, force those heuristics, find failure points, and prove whether a hypothesis is working or not. But when we're trying to think of what are those failure points and where does risk live, and risk does live wherever a bad actor can sort of creep in and do the thing they're not supposed to do, understanding those seams is pretty useful. And that's where thinking through the purpose of what we're trying to achieve, and then thinking of a tool that can enable us to achieve that purpose. And of course, really having those conversations and, even visualizing all of the messy discussions is pretty useful. I know for the last, I don't know how many years that I've been working, I've always been told if you really understand something, you can explain it to someone like they're 5. I wonder if we ever think about our tools like we're 5. I suppose if you give a 5-year-old a hammer, they might find something else to do with it, while the rest of us will perhaps be looking for nails. So how did domain modeling and bounded context solve a prioritization problem? I stop indulging myself at this point. Some of the things that we've already spoken about. Domain modeling holds clues to what's meaningful to the use case. And with domain modeling and trying to understand our problem space better, we also started understanding our heuristics better and the heuristics that were relevant to decision making. And furthermore, when you're modeling during discovery, that understanding and that modeling sort of helps down the stream with design and implementation as well. There's multiple types of value to be gotten out of it. So for our use cases, when you're talking of the change to a system, there is a clear seam, regardless of the heuristic, that talks about a high risk impact. And therefore, prioritizing that control is definitely a clear priority. But then when you start looking at the mandatory information control, it's really more of a business efficiency automation. And there is nothing wrong with automating for business efficiency. It's a really great thing to do. But that does not have security value. And our conversations are not about business efficiencies, but about the security value. And then infrastructure resilience, more than just reinforcing the value of automating controls around it, it really opened up conversations around what is our domain and what are we really up against. If you were to go back to the intent, reality, structure, adjust framework, we had the intent to identify value of automation and shape the work. The reality that we were working with is a constraint of time, information, and the business knowledge. We did not have infinite time and infinite money to automate everything and solve all of the problems. So the structure was to think about scenarios, to adapt a tool that's useful, that's relevant, that can help us get to the outcome, and then to model, visualize, and collaborate. And at the end of it, modify our priorities and the approach. I don't think there's anyone in this room who will disagree that all models are wrong. Like, we know it, all models are wrong. So then what's next? Does that mean that we do not model? No, on the contrary, we start from the point of utility to find out which models are useful. In fact, what I would really like to do, because we've just done this in one situation, in one scenario, but really test across use cases, test across industries, and really refine and evolve and see where this gets to. The more we experiment, that might lead to new insights, new perspectives, and perhaps more experimentation. That was it for me. Questions?
Do you mind going back to, there was a slide where you talked about, I think, the scenes and the end of your assignment, that one, yeah?
Yep.
So this is this saying that you did prove that security fails at the seams?
If we had proven, Martin, that security fails at the seams, I'd be talking to governments right now and making a lot of money. No, the experiment was across, a small defined number of use cases. We did start seeing a pattern emerge, and I've lost that slide. And there was definitely a correlation between seams and between high risk events. There's no breakthrough in security yet, which is also why I said I'd really like to experiment and test this more across industries and use cases, because bias is an amazing thing. And I really don't want to fall victim to confirmation bias. So I have not solved the security problem yet.
Research in progress.
Yes, research in progress.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's have this conversation after 10 years again.
Have you thought of other, this is a great example of taking a tool designed for one purpose and applying it to another purpose. Have you thought of other environments you might try to deploy the tool with kind of contexts, other scenarios that might be useful?
Nothing comes to mind, to be very honest. And also, I think I'm still perhaps new on my journey around learning about bounded context. So it's not a tool that I can say I really understand everything about it. So within the context of what I understand about bounded context, I feel that I'd perhaps apply it at similar scenarios to understand this better. But I definitely will get to a point where I have a better understanding of bounded context. And that's the point where I might have other use cases I could apply it to.
I have a question about heuristics.
Yep.
And so I was having a problem as you were going through this presentation to really understand what you mean by heuristics. And I'm guessing, I seem to remember that there are some DDD heuristics. Is that what you're referring to? Is that...
In its simplest form, a heuristic is a shortcut. And I'm trying to find the slide that has those boxes of shapes all grouped together. And this is what happens when the slide back is be there somewhere. But if you remember, bunch of shapes, and there was that slide where I said it'll come here right after this. Yeah. So now if you look at the first box, the heuristic, these are all things in the wild. And these are organized by color. So color is a shortcut that makes us feel, these can be grouped together. It's a shortcut that's specific to the domain. And it's a shortcut that helps you understand what are the things that could be grouped together, or what's the underlying criteria that enables decision making, and what would you then use. In our case, every heuristic that we were talking about was bringing it back to the question of, does this really help us understand the business risk? So regardless of what shortcut we use to group things together, is that answering the business risk question? Does anyone on the call have questions? Because I think we've been ignoring you folks who've been patiently here with us.
I just realized
I
camera has not been well.
I just realized that as well. So no one
Sorry,
can see
everyone.
me. Hey, but they could see the slide.
They could see the slides,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's good.
All right.
Well, if there are no more questions, either from folks on the call or on over here,
Mhm.
do we want to jump into perhaps discussion groups?
I think I already started. Yeah, so if you're on the call and you want to have a chat, even if it's not a question, but you just want to chat with the other people on the call, feel free to go off mute now. And yeah, chat
Yeah,
away, say hello.
And we can stop the recording here.
Yeah.